usually think of a bridge as, well, the most boring, reliable part of any journey.
Right.
I mean, it's basically just a structure of concrete and steel, anchored into the bedrock, quietly sitting there, just doing its job of connecting point A to point B.
Yeah, it's predictable. It's safe.
Exactly. But step into the world of strategic geography, and that whole expectation of stability just kind of shatters.
Oh, completely.
So imagine you're looking at a country that acts as the literal physical bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Only this bridge isn't made of concrete. It's built on these shifting geopolitical tectonic plates. We're looking at a nation where the massive forces of, multipolarity, maritime security, and a deeply fragmented civil war are just violently colliding right now.
It's a landscape where domestic collapse and international supply chains literally intersect. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Myanmar represents the absolute definition of a strategic flashpoint.
Which is exactly why we're executing a comprehensive deep dive into Myanmar's geostrategic importance today.
Specifically looking through the lens of India's national security and economic imperatives, right?
Exactly. Because to truly grasp the complex trade and security linkages here, we really have to dismantle the situation step by step for you.
Yeah, we need to map the internal fragmentation, analyze the geopolitical chessboard, and really break down India's exact policy responses.
Right. So let's wind the clock back to the trigger event that shattered the whole status quo. We're looking at November 2020.
Right, the national elections.
Yeah, Myanmar holds its national elections. Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League of Democracy, or the NLD, they secured this massive landslide victory.
They won, what, 396 seats?
396 out of the 476 available seats.
See, that specific number is so important. It really highlights the sheer scale of the civilian mandate.
It wasn't even close.
No, not at all. A
Mhm.
victory of 396 out of 476 seats is not some contested, razor-thin margin. It's a definitive, undeniable statement by the electorate.
They wanted to keep the democratic order that had been in place since 2015, basically.
Exactly. The population clearly signaled their desire to continue on that political trajectory. But then
Then comes February 2021. The Myanmar army, known as the Tatmadaw, they look at this overwhelming result, and they basically accuse the NLD of rigging the elections.
which leads to them completely voiding the results.
Right. They void it all and impose a nationwide state of emergency. They just tear down the entire democratic apparatus overnight.
It's pretty wild.
It is. It's comparable to a landlord violently evicting a tenant who just legitimately renewed their lease with the backing of the entire neighborhood,
That's a good way to look at it.
just because the landlord realizes they are permanently losing control of the building.
And, the immediate fallout was a direct reflection of that erased mandate. You had widespread, massive civilian protests erupting all across the country.
The public demand was pretty unambiguous.
Very. Restore the civilian government and release Aung San Suu Kyi alongside the other detained political leaders.
But the military junta, they formally structured themselves as the State Administration Council, right? The
Right.
SAC.
Yeah, the SAC. And they responded with brutal, repressive measures to quell those protests. I mean, the sheer scale of the violence fundamentally altered the country's trajectory.
And the international reaction perfectly sets the stage for the geopolitics we're going to analyze later. The United Nations Security Council, they actually drafted a resolution to propose sanctions on Myanmar.
But it didn't go through.
No, Russia and China stepped in and vetoed it.
Right.
Meanwhile, the US and the EU, they just bypassed the UN deadlock and proceeded with their own unilateral economic sanctions against the regime.
Which instantly creates this polarized international environment. You've got Western nations applying pressure through sanctions, aligning with their broader strategic emphasis on, human rights and democratic governance.
While Russia and China are playing a completely different game.
Exactly. They provided a crucial diplomatic shield at the highest levels of global governance. They essentially protected the junta from unified international isolation.
So I'm looking at this trigger event and the subsequent military takeover, and there's a glaring logical disconnect that stands out to me.
With that.
Well, the military took over the capital, Naypyidaw. They have the heavy weaponry, they have the air force, they have the institutional infrastructure. Yet we constantly hear that Myanmar is in a state of chaotic civil war. If the military holds all the conventional hard power, why hasn't that translated into actual control of the country?
Okay.
Yeah.
The answer to that lies in the severe fragmentation of the state that followed the coup.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the junta, the SAC, they retain formal control over the capital and the major urban economic centers, like Yangon.
Right.
However, their authority essentially stops at the city limits. The state has completely shattered into this highly volatile matrix of different armed actors, and they're contesting massive swaths of the countryside.
Let's categorize that matrix for you guys listening. Who is actually holding territory outside the major cities?
So there are three main categories of actors contesting the rural and border territories.
Okay, first group.
First are the EAOs, the ethnic armed organizations.
Right. They've been around for a while.
Yeah, Myanmar has a very deep history of ethnic conflict that significantly predates the 2021 coup. Many of these EAOs have been fighting for autonomy or federal arrangements for literally decades.
So they have established territories already.
Exactly. Established territories, independent resource streams, deep local roots. The coup just violently disrupted whatever fragile ceasefires they actually had with the central government.
So they are historical players whose operating environment just radically changed overnight. Who is the second group?
The second group is a direct product of the 2021 coup. The PDFs, or People's Defense Forces.
These are the newly formed militias, right?
Right. They function as armed civilian militias, and they are aligned with the parallel national unity government, the NUG.
And the NUG operates essentially as a shadow civilian government.
Exactly. They are seeking the complete restoration of the pre-2021 democratic order. The PDFs are the armed wing fighting that ideological battle on the ground.
Using guerrilla tactics mostly.
Yeah, highly decentralized guerrilla tactics against the conventional military forces.
Okay, so we have the junta holding the urban centers, the historical ethnic armies defending their borderlands, and these newly formed pro-democracy militias operating wherever they can gain a foothold.
Which is already incredibly complex.
Yeah.
But the third element complicates the matrix even further.
Let me guess. Criminal actors.
Nailed it. Whenever state authority collapses and competing armed factions prioritize survival over actual governance, organized crime steps right into the vacuum.
They exploit the chaos.
Completely. These syndicates contest territory strictly to secure lucrative, illegal supply chains. So we're talking drug peddling, human trafficking, and the massive smuggling of arms and ammunition across porous borders.
Wow. So looking at this analytically, resolving this conflict seems, nearly impossible. You can't just host a peace summit in Geneva and invite two sides to sign a treaty.
No, not at all.
There are dozens of sides, and they each have fundamentally incompatible objectives.
Which is why strategic logic dictates that peace remains highly unlikely in the short to medium term. The fragmentation of society eliminates any single negotiation table.
Right, because everyone wants something different.
Exactly. The EAOs demand territorial autonomy. The PDFs and the NUA demand the complete removal of the junta and the SAC. They demand total, uncontested control.
So there is absolutely zero overlapping ideological ground. Do we ever see pauses in the fighting, at least?
Localized ceasefires do occur, but they are entirely tactical.
Just to buy time.
Yeah, they are temporary, geographically limited, and very easily reversible. The junta utilizes a strategy of militarized counterinsurgency combined with selective engagement in these temporary ceasefires simply to survive.
So they can focus their forces elsewhere.
Right. They leverage states of emergency and draconian security laws to systematically crush political opposition in the areas they do control. As long as the military believes it can outlast the fragmented opposition or just consolidate its hold on the core economic zones, they have zero incentive for real structural compromise.
Okay, so the ruling military cannot secure the entire country internally. And the opposition is highly motivated but deeply fractured. This domestic weakness acts as a massive magnet, right? Inviting geopolitical interference.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the junta cannot secure the country independently, they've turned outward to survive.
Yeah, internal fragmentation consistently creates power vacuums that external states will move to fill. And that is especially true in a region as strategically vital as the Indo-Pacific.
Right. So isolated by Western economic sanctions, the junta logically turned to the two powers that previously vetoed the UNSC resolution.
Russia and China.
Let's examine Russia's involvement first. How are they enabling the junta?
So Russia's role focuses heavily on military hardware and material resilience. Since the coup, Russia has significantly deepened its defense ties with Naypyidaw.
Supplying weapons and things like that.
Yeah, they supply critical equipment, heavy munitions, and they engage in deep cooperation regarding drones and unmanned aerial vehicles.
Which is huge in this kind of conflict.
Exactly. In an asymmetric war against PDFs and EAOs fighting in difficult, mountainous terrain, having air superiority and drone surveillance capabilities, provides the military with a massive tactical advantage.
So Russia essentially functions as the junta's armory, which heavily undermines the pressure the West attempts to apply through economic sanctions.
Right, because if the junta has a steady supply of weaponry, their capacity to sustain the conflict just remains totally intact.
Okay, so that's Russia. But China's strategy operates on a far more intricate and multi-layered level, doesn't it?
Oh, China's executing what we can define as a dual game.
A dual game, how so?
Well, on the public diplomatic front, China strictly adheres to its traditional rhetoric of non-interference in Myanmar's internal affairs.
They say they aren't getting involved.
Right, but on the ground, they quietly but aggressively increase economic ties and actively push for localized negotiations between the military and specific armed groups.
Wait, pushing for negotiations seems contradictory if they claim not to care about the internal politics. Why would they intervene in local disputes?
Because China's strategic priority in Myanmar centers entirely on order, influence, and the protection of massive investments.
Specifically their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI projects.
Exactly. The specific regime type, whether Myanmar is a flourishing democracy or a brutal military dictatorship that is secondary to Beijing.
They just need stability.
Right. Beijing requires baseline stability along its border to protect critical pipelines, rail networks, and port developments.
Which brings us to a massive component of our deep dive today. The China Myanmar Economic Corridor, the CMEC.
Yes, CME.
This corridor appears to be the absolute cornerstone of China's strategy. Tracing this back to January 2020, so before the coup, President Xi Jinping visited Myanmar.
And that state visit served as a total watershed moment. President Xi announced a slew of multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, effectively bringing Myanmar fully into the BRI fold.
And the crown jewel of this is the CME.
Right, and anyone analyzing the Indo-Pacific really needs to link the CMSE in Myanmar to the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Oh, interesting.
Because the strategic intent behind both corridors is absolutely identical.
Well, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor connects Western China down to the Gwadar port in the Arabian Sea. So what is the specific geographic layout for the CMEC in Myanmar?
The CMEC designs a network of road and rail transportation corridors stretching from Kunming, which is located in China's landlocked Yunnan province.
Okay, so it starts in Yunnan.
Yeah. Then this network passes through vital Myanmar border towns like Muse, travels down through the central hub of Mandalay, and finally terminates at a massive deep-sea water port in Rakhine State.
And that port is called Kiakpu.
Exactly. Kiakpi Port on the Bay of Bengal.
Now, initially, wasn't this envisioned as a massive $7 billion project, but subsequent negotiations scaled it down to roughly $1 billion.
Yeah, that scaling down resulted from significant pushback by previous Myanmar governments. They were deeply wary of falling into a sovereign debt trap.
Which is a highly common concern with these massive BRI infrastructure loans globally.
Exactly. But even at a reduced valuation of $1 billion, the strategic value of Kiakpu to Beijing remains immense.
What else does the CMEC include besides the port?
The framework also involves developing a major economic zone in Yangon. But, it's worth noting that not every proposed Chinese project actually materializes.
No, like what?
Well, despite intense concerted diplomatic efforts by Beijing over several years, the highly controversial Myitsone megadam project in northern Myanmar remains abandoned.
That was suspended by a previous civilian government, right?
Right, and it remains totally devoid of revival prospects right now.
But even with the dam abandoned, the port and the economic corridor represent a monumental shift. I mean, China is essentially treating Myanmar as a giant physical bypass surgery for their global supply chains.
Bypass surgery is a perfect way to put it. To really understand the billions pouring into Myanmar, you have to analyze the concept of the Malacca Strait choke point.
Okay, let's unpack that.
This geographic feature dictates massive portions of Chinese strategic thinking.
So for you guys picturing the map, the Malacca Strait is that narrow body of water running between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra.
And historically, a vast majority of China's energy imports from the Middle East, alongside its massive export volume to Europe and Africa, physically pass through that strait.
It's one of the most congested and critical maritime choke points on the entire planet.
Exactly. And from a defense and economic perspective, China views this reliance as an unacceptable vulnerability.
Right, because in a scenario involving heightened geopolitical conflict, say, a naval blockade forced by the U.S. Navy or allied powers operating in the Indo-Pacific, China's entire economy could face strangulation if the Malacca Strait is closed.
They'd be completely cut off.
So looking at the geography, Kyaukphyu Port sits directly on the Bay of Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
By constructing a deep sea port there and connecting it via roads, railways, and those existing oil pipelines directly into Yunnan province, China completely circumvents the Malacca Strait.
Exactly. Maritime shipping can just offload oil, natural gas, and commercial goods directly at Kyaukphyu,
And from there, the cargo travels overland straight into southwestern China.
which drastically lowers overall transportation costs and really facilitates the economic development of China's landlocked southwest regions.
And most critically, it provides immense energy security by neutralizing that strategic threat of the Malacca maritime choke point.
Pragmatism is undeniable, but for Myanmar, facilitating this infrastructure incurs a really steep cost.
The debt.
Right. Financing these massive projects plunges the nation into heavy debt obligations to Beijing. And in international relations, heavy bilateral debt translates directly into immense political leverage.
So China's dual game engagement proves highly effective here. They secure a strategic alternative to the Malacca Strait, they fortify their critical supply chains, and they gain a decisive dominant voice in Myanmar's internal affairs.
And they achieve all of this while hiding behind a diplomatic facade of non-interference. It's incredibly strategic.
And the internal chaos just acts as an accelerant. While the state fragments, China is rapidly building a physical and economic bypass to the Bay of Bengal.
Which brings us to India's position.
Right. With a superpower re-engineering the supply chains right next door, India is forced to confront massive vulnerabilities and strategic imperatives of its own.
Evaluating India's position really requires starting with the sheer geographic reality. Myanmar functions as the absolute linchpin of India's Act East policy.
Let's expand on that.
Well, Myanmar stands as the single member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that shares a physical land border with India.
It operates as the literal geographic gateway to the east.
Exactly. If India intends to deepen its economic and strategic integration with Southeast Asia, the physical routes literally must pass through Myanmar territory.
And beyond physical geography, Myanmar serves as a vital bridge for regional cooperation institutions too, specifically BIMSTEC.
Yes, BIMSTEC,
Yeah.
the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation.
Let's break down why this specific institution carries so much weight for India.
The geopolitical weight of BIMSTEC really comes down to demographics and economic potential. The institution brings together nations situated around the Bay of Bengal, which accounts for roughly 21% of the global population.
That's massive.
And they boast a combined GDP approaching $2.5 trillion. So for policymakers in New Delhi, BIMSTEC is crucial because it offers a functional, dynamic, multilateral alternative to SAARC.
SAARC being the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And SAARC has remained essentially paralyzed for years, right?
Yeah, entirely paralyzed due to the persistent hostilities and intractable diplomatic strains between India and Pakistan.
So India desperately needs another multilateral vehicle to drive regional integration.
Exactly. And BIMSTEC, with Myanmar physically bridging South Asia and Southeast Asia, provides that exact vehicle.
Okay, so alongside these institutional frameworks, India also faces a fundamental economic imperative: energy security.
Right. India currently imports nearly 80% of its fuel requirements.
Which makes the nation highly dependent on external energy sources and very vulnerable to global price shocks.
And Myanmar possesses significant, proven reserves of oil and natural gas. Securing reliable access to those resources, located immediately across its own border, constitutes a major strategic priority for India's economic planners.
So we have the Act East policy, the BIMSTEC alternative to SAARC, and the drive for energy security. Let's examine the hard infrastructure of India's response to China's maneuvers.
Okay.
Because while China pushes the CMS and Kyaukphyu port, India counters with its own massively important initiative, the Kaladan Multi-Modal Transport Project.
The Kaladan project, originally conceived back in 2010, it represents a really critical piece of India's strategic puzzle.
What's the core objective there?
The core objective involves creating a multimodal transportation route connecting the eastern Indian seaport of Kolkata directly to India's landlocked and northeastern states.
Specifically targeting Mizoram.
Yes, specifically targeting Mizoram.
Let's trace the physical mechanics of this route so you can really visualize it. If a company has a massive shipment of goods in Kolkata, how does it actually reach Mizoram using the Kaladan infrastructure?
Okay, so the shipment first leaves Kolkata via sea. It traverses the Bay of Bengal to reach Sitwe port.
Sitwe is in Myanmar.
Right. Sittwe operates as a deep-water port located at the mouth of the Kaladan River in Myanmar's Rakhine State. Crucially, the Indian government financed and oversaw the construction of this port, and it's already operationalized.
Okay, so the sea route covers the distance from Kolkata to Sittwe in Myanmar. What happens to the cargo upon arrival?
At Sittwe, the logistics shift. The cargo is transferred from ocean-going vessels onto smaller, specialized freight carriers.
Riverboats, essentially.
Yeah, these river carriers then sail upstream, navigating the Kaladan River directly into the Indian state of Mizoram.
Wow.
The initial phase of this highly integrated project, which encompassed the major seaport construction, represents a $500 million endeavor.
And how is that funded?
It was funded entirely through a long-term, interest-free loan provided by New Delhi to Myanmar.
Providing an interest-free loan of that magnitude really highlights the sheer strategic necessity of the project. I'm looking at a map of India in my head, and this project solves a total geographic nightmare.
The chicken's neck.
Exactly. The massive northeastern states of India are connected to the rest of the mainland by this incredibly narrow, fragile strip of land located in West Bengal, sandwiched awkwardly between Bhutan and Bangladesh.
Geopolitical analysts universally refer to this choke point as the chicken's neck, or the Siliguri Corridor, and it represents one of the most acute geographic vulnerabilities endured by any major global power.
Because in a severe conflict scenario with a hostile neighbor, if military forces manage to sever the chicken's neck, what happens?
The entirety of India's northeast becomes physically cut off from the mainland.
Which is terrifying from a defense perspective.
Exactly. So the Kaladan project provides an entirely alternative supply route. By utilizing the sea and the river through Myanmar, India completely bypasses the chicken's neck.
This drastically lowers both the financial cost and the sheer distance required to move essential goods and military supplies from mainland India into the landlocked northeast.
And from a broader geopolitical perspective, India's development of Sittwe port acts as a direct, tangible counterweight to Chinese ambitions.
Oh, for sure. India essentially preempted a total Chinese monopoly over the region's maritime infrastructure.
Right. While China constructs the Kyaukphyu port further down the coastline in Rakhine State, India maintains its strategic foothold at Sittwe.
Which prevents Beijing from establishing uncontested dominance over that critical Bay of Bengal coastline.
Precisely.
So we see the economic and strategic counterbalancing playing out through these massive infrastructure projects. But let's pull the focus back to the internal situation in Myanmar for a second.
Okay.
How does the fragmented state, the civil war, and the breakdown of authority actually impact India on a day-to-day security level?
The correlation between Myanmar's internal chaos and India's domestic security is absolute and immediate.
Because of the border.
Yes. India shares a highly porous, deeply complex land border with Myanmar. When the central state apparatus in Myanmar breaks down, the resulting instability inevitably spills directly over the border into Indian states, particularly Manipur and Assam.
So we are looking at direct insurgency spillovers.
Completely. Maintaining robust cooperation with whatever central authority holds power in Myanmar is absolutely crucial for the Indian security apparatus.
They need that cooperation to effectively manage and suppress insurgencies operating within their own northeastern states.
Right. Furthermore, the porous nature of the border, combined with the massive power vacuum created by the fragmented state we mapped earlier, it generates incredibly fertile ground for transnational organized crime.
Like the syndicates we talked about.
Exactly. Law enforcement faces massive syndicates operating human trafficking rings, widespread drug peddling, and the large-scale smuggling of arms and ammunition across the border into India.
So if you are sitting in a policy briefing in New Delhi, the reality is stark. India must engage with the military junta.
They have no choice.
India does not have the geopolitical luxury of imposing moralistic sanctions and disengaging, which is a strategy utilized by the U.S. or the EU from thousands of miles away.
No. India requires the Myanmar military's operational cooperation to secure its borders, interdict arms smuggling networks, and ensure the multi-million-dollar Kaladan project doesn't get overrun or sabotaged by local insurgent groups.
And this forms the absolute core of India's strategic dilemma. Pragmatic engagement is a strict requirement for national security. However, India must navigate this engagement with extreme caution, right?
Incredible caution.
Yeah.
Because if New Delhi aligns too visibly or too closely with the repressive military junta, it risks severely alienating the local border communities within its own northeastern states.
And many of these Indian communities share deep historical ethnic ties to the very groups actively fighting the junta inside Myanmar.
Exactly. A heavy-handed approach could trigger massive refugee flows across the border if violence escalates drastically in response to Indian support for the junta.
So India has to maintain intense strategic autonomy in this scenario. Policymakers cannot afford international optics portraying India as purely backing a violent, repressive regime.
But conversely, they absolutely cannot afford to step back and allow China to operate as the sole, uncontested power broker in Nepeta.
It requires a phenomenal tightrope act. New Delhi has to balance internal border security, geopolitical counterweighting against Chinese supply chains, and complex domestic ethnic sensitivities all simultaneously.
It's a massive challenge.
Now, while India navigates this unilaterally due to its shared border, the broader regional response relies entirely on institutional frameworks. Let's examine ASEAN's attempt to manage the crisis and the critical decisions from the 2025 summit.
Okay, so the Association of Southeast Asian Nations officially assumed the lead role in attempting to mediate the conflict and restore baseline peace in Myanmar.
This started pretty early on, right?
Yeah, in April 2021, shortly after the coup, ASEAN convened a high-level emergency summit. They invited the junta chief, Min Aung Hlaing, and collectively established a diplomatic framework known as the Five-Point Consensus, or the 5PC.
So the five-point consensus serves as the foundational text for regional diplomacy regarding this crisis. What specific actions did those 5 points demand?
The framework demanded the following. Number 1, an immediate cessation of violence across Myanmar, requiring all armed parties to exercise maximum restraint.
Okay, that makes sense.
Number 2, the commencement of constructive dialogue among all parties concerned to seek a peaceful, negotiated solution.
Logical next step.
Number 3, the appointment of a special envoy of the ASEAN chair to actively mediate the dialogue process, assisted by the Secretary General of ASEAN. Number 4, the provision of humanitarian assistance managed through the AHA Center.
That's the Asian Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, right?
Right. And finally, number 5, the special envoy and an accompanying delegation must visit Myanmar to meet physically with all parties involved in the conflict.
So cessation of violence, constructive dialogue, a special envoy mediator, humanitarian assistance via the AHA, and a delegation visit.
That's the 5PC.
On paper, it reads like a really comprehensive, logical diplomatic roadmap. But how do you execute point number 4, delivering humanitarian aid, when the central government is actively bombing the specific populations that need the aid?
I mean, did the junta actually comply with any of this?
Not at all. The reality on the ground demonstrated stark, unyielding non-compliance. ASEAN found itself entirely without consensus on how to practically force the junta to adhere to these 5 steps.
They just ignored it.
Pretty much. The military continued its brutal counterinsurgency campaigns and steadfastly refused any meaningful dialogue with the Nagy or the PDFs.
So what did ASEAN do?
In response to this blatant defiance, ASEAN took a significant, unprecedented step. They officially banned Myanmar's military leaders from participating in any of ASEAN's top-level summits and events. Which delivers a huge diplomatic snub, obviously, but it doesn't really change the trajectory of bullets on the ground.
No, it doesn't.
This brings us to the crucial October 2025 ASEAN Summit. This summit functioned as the critical moment for review and a definitive decision on the failing implementation of the 5-point consensus. What did they conclude?
Well, the 2025 summit served as a vital diagnostic moment for the region. First, ASEAN explicitly reaffirmed a critical chronological sequence.
Meaning the order in which things have to happen.
Yes. They stated unequivocally that a verifiable cessation of violence must precede any meaningful political dialogue or any attempt at credible elections. Holding a forced election in an active war zone cannot manufacture legitimacy.
That statement directly counters the junta's internal timeline for survival.
It does. Second, the summit explored the structural mechanics of their mediation. They debated appointing a longer-term ASEAN special envoy.
Why does the length of the term matter?
Because historically, the envoy changes annually with the rotating ASEAN chairmanship. A one-year term makes it virtually impossible to build the deep, trusting relationships necessary for complex, multi-party mediation.
Oh, I see. By the time you understand the players, you're replaced.
Exactly. A longer-term envoy provides crucial continuity for tracking progress and negotiating humanitarian access.
What was the third point from the summit?
Third, they stressed that any scheduled election engineered by the junta must be strictly inclusive and preceded by extensive dialogue with all opposition groups.
You know, I am looking at ASEAN's foundational rulebook, and a massive structural handicap seems obvious here.
The non-interference clause.
Yes. The absolute core principle of ASEAN since its inception has always been strict non-interference in the domestic affairs of its member states. How can an institution effectively mediate a sprawling civil war if its legal mandate prohibits interference?
You've identified the exact structural limitation crippling their response. ASEAN fundamentally lacks any hard enforcement
They
mechanisms.
can't compel compliance.
No, they possess no regional military force, nor do they have a binding unified sanctions regime they can deploy against a rogue member state.
Hmm.
Furthermore, differing national priorities severely fracture any attempt at consensus.
How so? Give me an example.
Consider Thailand and Bangladesh. Now, while Bangladesh is not an ASEAN, it acts as a key neighbor. Both nations are dealing with massive, immediate destabilizing refugee pressures and severe border security risks caused by the fighting.
The spillover effect we talked about.
Right. Thailand has had to implement pragmatic, unilateral steps, like allowing some refugees temporary legal work status simply to manage the sheer volume of the crisis. Their immediate security priorities differ drastically from member states like Indonesia or Singapore.
Because Indonesia and Singapore don't share a land border.
Exactly. They face no direct border threat and might prefer to take a harder ideological line on democratic principles, whereas Thailand just needs to secure its border.
So a consensus without enforcement is essentially just a suggestion. Did the 2025 summit accomplish anything tangible, or was it purely rhetorical?
I mean, while it lacked teeth regarding new binding sanctions, the summit did deliver a vital diplomatic signal.
By rejecting the election plan.
Yes, by officially mandating that violence cessation must strictly precede any elections, ASEAN explicitly rejected the junta's overarching strategy.
Because the military plan to use forced, highly controlled elections as a quick administrative fix to manufacture domestic and international legitimacy.
Right, and ASEAN publicly denied them that path. The summit successfully maintained pressure by ensuring the Myanmar crisis remains categorized as a top regional security threat.
It's a signal to global powers.
Precisely. It signaled to China, India, and the Western Bloc that Myanmar cannot simply revert to business as usual without deeply engaging the regional diplomatic framework.
Okay, bringing all these massive threads together gives us a complete, highly volatile picture. We have violent internal state fragmentation. We have China rapidly constructing strategic ports to bypass the Malacca Strait. We have India accelerating the Kaladan project to bypass the vulnerable Chicken's Neck. And we have ASEAN trapped in diplomatic gridlock.
It's a perfect storm.
Based on all these vectors, what is the most likely future trajectory for Myanmar? How does India write its strategic playbook for the coming years?
The immediate focal point defining the near future centers on the junta's highly controversial plan for elections. The military apparatus has announced preparations for a phased election process, tentatively targeting late 2025 or early 2026.
But crucially, they plan to hold these elections only in the specific urban and central areas they firmly control, right?
Yes.
Based on the fragmentation we mapped earlier, holding elections only in junta-controlled territory makes the process dead on arrival in terms of actual legitimacy.
Absolutely. The major opposition actors, the NUG and the heavily armed established EAOs, they have completely and aggressively rejected participation.
They view it as a sham.
Yeah, a transparent sham designed to entrench military rule. International human rights organizations have already published assessments deeming the proposed elections highly unlikely to be free, fair, or inclusive. I mean, large swaths of the country's geography remain either highly insecure war zones or are actively governed by anti-junta administration.
If the junta forces these phased elections through in Yangon and Nay Pyi Taw, what actual result does that produce on the ground? Does a sham election buy them a temporary peace?
The historical precedent suggests the exact opposite, actually. Forced elections are highly likely to trigger renewed, heavily intensified offensives by anti-junta forces.
It'll get worse.
Oh yeah. The PDFs and EAOs will actively seek to disrupt the voting process to fundamentally delegitimize the military's narrative of control.
But the junta still pushes for it.
Because they intend to use whatever fractured vote occurs to claim baseline domestic legitimacy and argue for diplomatic normalization with pragmatic, stability-focused foreign states.
But broader international recognition will remain severely limited.
Exactly. Likely arriving only from states that prioritize raw geopolitical stability over democratic norms, like China.
So if the elections spark more violence, what is the overarching long-term scenario we are looking at?
Barring a massive, unforeseen shock to the geopolitical system.
Like what kind of shock?
Well, such as a major violent political fracture emerging from deep within the Tatmadaw leadership itself, or a total, irreversible macroeconomic collapse, or a radical, unexpected shift in major power posture from Beijing or Washington.
Okay, but assuming none of those black swan events happen.
Then the most probable scenario involves a durable, low-intensity civil war. This conflict will stretch out for years, punctuated intermittently by the localized, highly temporary ceasefires we discussed.
Meaning the internal humanitarian crisis will persist and likely deepen significantly.
Yes.
This grim forecast makes India's balancing strategy incredibly perilous. I mean, how does New Delhi systematically navigate a permanent, low-intensity war festering directly on its border?
India's strategic playbook rests on several non-negotiable pillars. First, as we established through the economic linkages, India simply cannot afford a scenario where Naypyidaw falls into a complete, unchecked military and economic alignment with Beijing.
Right, because if Myanmar transitions into a fully integrated proxy state of China, India's entire security architecture on its eastern flank basically collapses.
Exactly. Therefore, pragmatic, continuous engagement with the Myanmar army, regardless of the regime's brutal nature or international pariah status, remains fundamentally non-negotiable for Indian policymakers.
They just have to hold their nose and deal with them.
They must keep intelligence and diplomatic lines of communication permanently open.
Because ceding the diplomatic playing field means allowing China uncontested access to the Bay of Bengal.
Right. Simultaneously, India must actively prepare its domestic infrastructure for the reality of an extended multi-year civil war directly impacting its northeast.
Which demands incredibly tight, highly nuanced policy coordination between the central government ministries in New Delhi and the state governments operating in the border regions.
They face the monumental task of managing violent security spillovers, interdicting smuggling routes, and handling refugee influxes without alienating the local Indian communities who share deep ethnic ties across the porous border.
And securing those borders and maintaining stability in the Northeast ties directly into India's broader domestic goals like Atmanirbhar Bharat.
The push for self-reliance.
Yes, you can't build robust internal economic development in the Northeast if the border is a war zone facilitating arms smuggling.
Exactly.
So Myanmar remains the absolute keystone. If India wants a successful neighborhood-first policy, a functional Act East policy, and a secure Indo-Pacific presence, ignoring Myanmar is a geopolitical impossibility.
The chaos must be actively, daily managed. It requires a level of strategic agility, deep patience, and tolerance for diplomatic ambiguity that goes far beyond standard treaty-based international relations.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We traced the history from the 2020 elections through the coup. We mapped the internal fragmentation with the EAOs and the NUG.
We explored China's massive CMSE infrastructure aiming to bypass the Malacca Strait and India's Kaladan project pushing to bypass the Chicken's Neck.
We analyzed the failure of ASEAN's five-point consensus and the grim reality of upcoming forced elections. If I'm trying to synthesize this entire situation into a cohesive summary for you guys listening to really lock this in, it essentially boils down to a massive infrastructure duel superimposed over a shattered state.
That's a great way to put it. And if you're building a mental structure to remember all this, say a 250-word answer framework in your head, you really want to focus on India's cautious hedging strategy.
Right. How should they find that?
In your introduction, you'd immediately hit the geography. Myanmar is the BIMSTEC bridge and the sole ASEAN land border. Then in the body, you contrast the economic trade security linkages.
So you weigh the Kaladan project against the CMSE and Kakpu port bypassing Malacca.
Exactly. And you pair that against the security dilemmas. Manipur and Assam spillovers versus China's influence.
And for a conclusion,
You tie it back to India's cautious hedging strategy. Pragmatic engagement to protect Atmanirbhar Bharat and domestic security in the Northeast, while nominally supporting ASEAN's 5PC to maintain regional ties.
those are definitely the key words to underline mentally. Five-point consensus, CMA, Kaladan Multi-Modal, Chicken's Neck, EAOs, NUG, strategic autonomy.
Exactly.
Let's do a quick rapid-fire recall for you listening to make sure we've locked in the geography and the terminology. Just answer these in your head. What river connects Sittwe to Mizoram?
That would be the Kaladan River.
Right. What Chinese port bypasses the Malacca Strait?
The Kyakpu port,
What year was the democratic government ousted?
2021.
And finally, which regional body brings together a $2.5 trillion GDP as an alternative to SARC?
BIMSTEC.
Perfect. So the cause and effect chain drives everything. The domestic fragmentation following the 2021 coup forced the junta into heavy reliance on external enablers.
Primarily Russia for arms and China for economic shielding.
And this reliance accelerated China's CME's expansion to secure its Indo-Pacific supply chains.
Which in turn created an absolute unavoidable imperative for India to accelerate its Kaladan project and forcefully secure its northeastern borders against insurgency spillovers.
Geopolitics, economics, border security, and domestic impacts are seamlessly, violently linked.
It functions as a perfect, highly tense, closed loop.
You know, looking at the reality of this fragmented state leaves us with a deeply provocative thought about the future of international relations itself.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we are heavily conditioned to view geopolitics entirely through the lens of national capitals. When we think of diplomacy, we picture grand summits in Geneva or massive trade treaties signed by central governments in Naypyidaw, New Delhi, or Beijing. We inherently assume diplomacy is conducted state to state.
However, if Myanmar's state apparatus is permanently fractured, if the actual authority on the ground is permanently dispersed among dozens of localized ethnic armed organizations, decentralized people's defense forces, and heavily armed criminal syndicates, then the traditional models of diplomacy might be entirely obsolete in this specific geography.
Exactly. If the central government sitting in the capital cannot physically control the territory where these massive billion-dollar geopolitical projects are being built, then perhaps the future of the Indo-Pacific supply chains won't be negotiated in grand capitals at all.
The fate of this CMSE or the Kaladan project might not depend on treaties signed by generals.
Perhaps the new diplomacy will have to be conducted valley by valley, port by port, militia by militia. It forces regional powers like India to completely reinvent what diplomacy and strategic autonomy actually mean when dealing with a shattered state.
Navigating a landscape where central authority evaporates, yet massive economic imperatives remain. I mean, that is the defining challenge of the emerging multipolar world.
I encourage you to let these strategic linkages settle. The next time you read a headline about a border skirmish, a new trade corridor announcement, or a regional summit in Southeast Asia, apply these frameworks.
Look for the geographic choke points, the supply chain bypasses, and the internal state fragmentation.
You will start to see the hidden architecture behind the news. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we will see you next time.